Hello and welcome to another edition of On the Line, Perspectives on Partition. I'm Paul McFadden, and throughout this series, which is the brainchild of the Bloody Sunday Trust, I've been talking to people from a wide range of backgrounds about a seminal event in modern Irish history, the partition of the island 100 years ago. I say Irish history, but it's been a not insignificant event in British history as well, the legacy of which overshadows the UK's Brexit divorce from the European Union. Our guest today is an academic from the School of Law at Queens University. She's also worked for a variety of international governments and international organisations. Dr Yassin Brunger, thanks for joining us, first of all. You have an incredibly rich and diverse academic background, but in a way, I think the most intriguing thing about you is your Twitter profile, which describes you or mentions Belfast via Banjul.
Yeah.
So explain that that kind of a very unusual journey, if I could put it like that.
Yeah, first off, I want to say thank you so much to the Bloody Sunday Trust for this invitation and to be in conversation with you, Paul, about this topic, but also I think what kind of connects us in thinking together about the legacies of partition. From the perspective of a Black African woman feminist who is living on the island of Ireland. So my Twitter profile, where it says Belfast, Banjul via Belfast, is an interesting one because I think it reflects so much about a personal and professional history tied to Belfast. So it really starts off long ago with my dad. So my dad in the 70s was part of a group of civil servants in the Gambia who were brought over by the British government to Belfast as part of like a training knowledge exchange exercise, I suppose is what it would have been at the time. And so, you know, to be in Belfast in the 70s was a particular point in time, a particular history, a particular geography. And I didn't know this about him until I got my PhD offer at Queens. And I said to him, oh, you know, I've got this offer to go to this university. And all of a sudden this family history came out. And I think that's where I started to like wonder and be curious about this place, its history, its kind of post-conflict identity and what that means, the communities here. And so when I moved here in 2006 to as a student to do my PhD at Queens, you know, that's where my relationship with Belfast, with the north here, really comes to its own. I fell in love with the place, and I think I've lived in so many different countries. I was brought up in the Middle East. I've lived in England and various places, but there's a particular affinity that I have for Northern Ireland and what's been going on. And I think when I put that on my profile, it's reflective of a particular fondness and a particular professional history and a particular family tie. So yeah, I see a connection very much between Belfast and Banjul. We're similar sized populations. We've got very, very interesting alignments when it comes to our colonial histories. Yeah, there's a whole process going on at the minute in Gambia about kind of a truth commission process, the truth fact-finding process to deal with the legacies of our recent past under an authoritarian president. So, and all the gross human rights violations that occurred during that time, and the activism and mobilization that led to the change to the new democracy that Gambia now is. I think there's so much I learned from living and being in Belfast in Northern Ireland and really understanding what legacies of conflict, imperialistic, colonial histories look like. So yeah, I always kind of proudly put that on my Twitter.
So, I mean, you sound like an almost perfect kind of a guest to bring some kind of shape to discussion about partition on this island, because you know, obviously, all about borders and all of that. You talked about those, the investigation of human rights abuses by a previous president. That is in the time since the Gambia was independent.
Yes, that's right.
maybe we'll come to that in a moment, if that's okay. Because one other thing that strikes me about you, you mentioned your profile, your academic profile. You taught previously at the University of Leicester in England. You taught at UCD in Dublin. And you taught previously at the University of Ulster here in the north in Northern Ireland. I mean, right there, that's a Good Friday Agreement almost happening, isn't it? Kind of stalking you in your academic career. It's internal within Northern Ireland. It's north south and it's east west.
Yeah, yeah. I never thought about it that way, Paul, and I'm going to credit you for that from now on, because I think that's so true, and I think it's been interesting because both understanding how the situation here, the history here, current affairs here are so misunderstood when you just take a short plane ride and hop over to England, and then how you have a different perspective, understanding, impetus and urgency when you move to, when I worked in Dublin. So I just thought, yeah, I never really connected it in that way, but I think that's so true. And it's part of how I feel that living here, there's so much to understand and excavate about histories, past, present, and future, really, which is one of the things that kind of concerns me, because, you know, if we get into the kind of brass tacks about it, the Good Friday Agreement does not speak to ethnic minority communities in Northern Ireland. It really doesn't, right? And I think, you know, we can all agree that here in the North, things have changed. The idea of communities is not just limited to a binary identity, because many people are coming here and have been here for a long time. Communities like the Chinese community, the South Asian community, the Indian community, many Africans who have been here. I know a lot of people who migrated here with Caribbean heritage. This is an attractive place to be and live and be part of. And so it's interesting how we start to think about the legacies of partition and what that has kept intact in terms of community identity in a society that is ever changing really quickly.
Do you feel comfortable in Northern Ireland as a Black African woman?
Oh, I think that's such a great question. Oh, my hesitation. Why am I hesitant? Why am I hesitant? Yeah. I'm hesitant because I think I want to say yes. And I'll say yes, but I think it's a comfortability afforded to me by certain privileges, afforded to me by the fact that I'm a well-educated, I work at a university, I represent a certain income bracket, so I can choose to insulate myself from some more difficult tensions that, say, other Black women I've spoken to don't have. Let's just take it as a simple example. I live in the South Belfast Malone area. That is a particular demographic that one could call a mixed area, right? Because I wanted to choose somewhere that I felt entirely safe. But, you know, I have my sisters, my kind of like Black sisters here in Belfast, who live in different parts of the city, from the Falls Road to the Shankill, to parts of East Belfast, to up on the Antrim Road and Cave Hill. And we talk about, and they always say, oh, yes, there's a little bubble in Malone. And I can understand it, because many of them have faced racial abuse, harassment in different localities. And I, when moving back to Northern Ireland after my first experience here, made a deliberate choice to look for places where I just thought, I don't want to deal with this, or I want to minimize it as much as possible. And that is an economic privilege that I was able to garner and find somewhere that my Belfast sisters don't necessarily have to be able to, say, for instance, afford some of the extraordinary prices here in Malone. And so that's what I mean about, I have certain privileges that allow me to say, yes, I'm comfortable, but then other times it's difficult. There's a sense of always being othered. So even though I've lived on the island of Ireland in different ways for 10 years plus now, I am always asked, like, where are you from? So nowadays I just say, oh, Belfast. And there's always just this like resistance to even imagine that that could be a possibility. So I think it's a conditional yes, yeah. But in so many ways, you know, I see a younger generation of Black Irish growing up here, Black kids in Belfast who will not be told that they are not born and bred from here, that have a strong sense of who they are and their identity, and a confidence that they can confront racism and push it back for what it is. Then myself or their moms have this hesitancy of what it means to be kind of like the first generation here, or the first set of ones moving here and living here. And so I think, yeah, it's a great question.
It's really, you know, fascinating listening to you talking about that kind of experience, because there are a lot of isms that are being confronted, probably for the first time in the history of this place within the last 20 years. They're being kind of challenged, and yet, even, I mean, you're talking about being having certain privileges because of, you know, where you work, and probably the kind of income you enjoy and stuff like that because of your work as an academic, and yet even in the very recent past, we have a white woman who was First Minister of Northern Ireland,
yes,
talking about experiencing sexism and talking about, you know, that whole idea of what you can't see, you can't be, and experiencing that struggle in her life, even with the privilege of you know, political clout, and I mean, a lawyer by training and all of that, and
yep,
still confronting problems. And I mean, that kind of should unnerve everybody who lives here.
Yeah, and I think you're so right, Paul. And the unnerving is something that I think is it can't be unfamiliar. Let's put it that way. So I remember having a conversation, an event at Queens about decolonizing the curriculum. And there was part of the discussion that centered around even using that terminology, decolonization. Like, can you use that here? What are the implications of it? Is it the right word to use? Because
who was uncomfortable with that word as a matter of
it was a question from someone in the audience. So the panel had presented, and then someone in the audience, and I don't know their particular kind of reason for asking that question, but they sort of raised it. And so the panelists who were surprised by it, because they were kind of had talked about decolonization in England quite a lot. So when they came here and they were invited here to do the same, they were sort of surprised by what the question. But I think I was really inspired by a student who kind of responded, again, a member of the audience, who said, you know, why are we saying this is a difficult term to use here? In Northern Ireland, since when have we been afraid of difficult conversations, of difficult terminology? Like, it's been part of our histories, and I think we shouldn't be hesitant to confront that. And I think that's exactly how I feel about racism, about sexism, about homophobia, about wherever, you know, where we need to be talking about the different isms that you made reference to, is that, to me, this is a place that can have these difficult conversations, these hesitancies about, oh wow, Arlene Foster's privilege didn't afford her that kind of clear pathway to leadership that was just uninterrupted by sexism. Yeah, it exists. There are things that are entrenched in our society that, in order to really, really change, we have to confront openly, honestly, candidly, have those difficult conversations, because it's through those that we can start to move towards a better place. Because racism is entrenched, a kind of imperialistic colonial histories are entrenched. These are structures of power, organization, hierarchies, sexism that have existed for so long. They're not going to go overnight. So our resistance has to be just as energetic, dynamic, and imaginative.
I'm interested in your perspective, because I mean, thinking about your links with the Gambia, and your mother still lives in the Gambia. Well, one of the interesting things about it was that the Gambia had experienced colonization by the British, became independent in, was it 1965, left the Commonwealth in 2013, and decided to rejoin the Commonwealth, which, you know, as an Irish person, I mean, I find that an extraordinary kind of a thing. Now, I'm imagining you follow events in the Gambia very, very closely. Like, how do you explain something like that?
I think I think one can explain it in terms of the politics of inclusion at the table of power. So Gambia, we're the smallest country on continental Africa. And, you know, there is no doubt that we are one of the kind of poor, underdeveloped nations in the world. And yet there is so much attachment to and reverence to, like, the British establishment, the British system, whether it's through our schools, whether it's through the fact that our parliamentary system is modeled similarly, whether it's our legal system is a common law system that follows the kind of British model that was imposed. There are still laws from the colonial room. There's so much attached to that Gambian identity as it was imagined through the lens of its colonial master. So when we left the Commonwealth, that was as a result of a president who was pushing forward a very anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist impulse. He kept saying, we don't want to be part of Britain and their ideas about homosexuality, ideas about this, ideas about that. And so his motivations were entirely political in a kind of African nationalism, a Gambian nationalism, to counter what was still British colonial influences and the afterlives of that. And we can't deny that, right? And so when we rejoined the Commonwealth, it was part of the new government that came into place, and that sense of rejoining this club. I mean, I think the Commonwealth is one of the most useless organizations about, and I say that on record. I mean, to join this club, this exclusive club, set up by our former colonial power to control its former colonies. So we're going back into the, yeah, so that was part of courting international recognition that Gambia was no longer part of this, like, had this crazy dictator who had committed all these human rights violations, who was isolating Gambia from the rest of the world. We were now back in polite international society. We were joining the Commonwealth. We were going to do all these things, but yet, you know, what has Britain ever really done for the Gambia? What has Britain ever really done for Gambian people? And yes, I think for me, certainly in the family that I was brought up with, who are very politically aware, pays attention to this, there is a sense of what can Gambia do for herself, and our kind of pride in who we are as people. And I see that so much with our young people who are not attached to British colonial identities, the idea that Brits are better, or the land of Britain is the place of freedom and fortune. We can make freedom and fortune in Gambia. And I see that just surging up and swelling up within the kind of politics and civil society space and activists. And that is great. So the talk now is the diaspora coming back to the country. Let's build up our nation, you know, because for too long, we haven't had that. And I think it's that power to the people that will ultimately, I hope, one day see us leave the Commonwealth.
Again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
but for good.
It's interesting when you're talking about clubs there. I wonder, given your, your international experience and breadth of vision, what you would make of the decision by, well, a majority of people in the UK to leave the European Union, which it clearly wasn't what a majority of people in Northern Ireland wanted to see happening. It wasn't what a majority of people in London wanted to see happening. It wasn't what a majority of people in Scotland wanted to see happening. But there we have it. Brexit is, I was going to say a fait accompli. It kind of almost in a way feels as though it's not quite been accomplished yet. But what's your view of Brexit and that decision to move out of the European Union and that particular club?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I was living in the north of England at the time, and was working in Leicester, and it was so interesting to see the kind of conversations and sentiments that were happening around Brexit. And I think we cannot move away from the idea of border control and immigration being one of the biggest issues when it came to Brexit, in the very sense of who we keep out and who we let in. And that is just, even at a simple question, it's going to be racialized, there's going to be hierarchies, it's going to be classist, we're going to let in, key Australian workers with good skills, but not make it still very difficult for the South African doctor who's qualified and has years of experience, which is the reality of the immigration system and the hostile environment in the UK. And I think what's so interesting is that I was not surprised about the outcome of the Brexit vote, maybe because of the locations that I lived in and the conversations that I was kind of in close proximity to. I kind of felt like this was going to happen. I wasn't aware what was going on in Northern Ireland. So when I saw the disparities so clearly, I was like, well, let's see what they're going to do. Let's see what they're going to do now. But ultimately, that rule by Westminster, that sense that England still holds so much power to make seismic geopolitical decisions, even though you've got Northern Ireland, you've got Scotland, you've got Wales. Ultimately, what happens in England can shape so much. And I think that, to me, is just an afterlife of colonialism, right? Where England is a colonial power, and then Britain can rule so many territories. I mean, it's just, it's unsurprising. It's disappointing in so many ways, but so unsurprising for me. So I suppose my thoughts on it was, we got to concentrate our minds on what happens next. Whether it's about, thinking about how, one particular interest I have is around kind of border control and immigration, and the kind of policies that will come out. The hostile environment has gotten just increased and up the ante, whether it's a discussion about, having a referendum here about Irish unity, things that have to happen. Scotland are constantly talking about independence. So I think the United Kingdom, as it were, has to be really tested for what it is. And I think when you've got such disparities, that, one needs to pay attention to that. But I think it's activists and organizers and communities who, again, will hold people to account in power. And that is so hard. And it's a long task. So it's one of the things that I say to friends and activists in Gambia. Our journey is a long one, and we may not be alive to see it happen, right? The outcome happen, but nonetheless, we must commit ourselves to it, whether it's getting Gambia out of the Commonwealth or seeing, a first female president in Gambia, which is one of the things I care about. So whatever it may be, I think the kind of post-Brexit, which we're living in now, it is the most important time for our activism.
They say, though, if the Gambia proves anything at all, Yassin, it is that a country can leave a club and then rejoin it. It occurs to me while you're talking. I mean, would you rule that out happening in terms of the European Union and the UK?
Oh gosh, I would leave it to my fantastic colleagues in the law school who specialize in Brexit to comment on that. But it's always a possibility. You know, in international law it is. But you join the club with different conditions, obviously with the EU. So and the euro would be one of them, I would imagine.
Yeah, you talked about the. I think you've mentioned a couple of times here the conversation, the human rights abuses under a previous president.
Yeah.
And there's an investigation of all that going on at the minute.
Mm-hmm.
What about, you know, a country being able to, I'm thinking about legacy in Northern Ireland, obviously, a country being able to get, it almost sounds, I don't want to sound in any way insensitive, but to get through its past rather than get over it, that's a very good thing to say, but to get through it, because it is a difficult kind of a process for people who've been hurt to go through and for a society to overcome.
You know, when we talk about human rights abuses and human rights violations, I always go back to reminding people that this is a person, a family. Exactly as you say, it's hurt and pain and suffering that is caused. You know, there is a how we categorize it is one thing, but this is a story of a life, of lives affected by actions of, certainly in Gambia's case, the actions of the state and the apparatus of the state. And I think it's been interesting to compare Gambia and Northern Ireland, because once the former president left, after, or basically was escorted out of the country because he refused to leave after he lost the election.
He was shown the door.
Pressured, and ultimately ECOWAS militarily intervened in order to ensure that there was a transition of power. But once that happened and he left Gambian airspace, the conversation happened immediately about, right, we need to start talking about how we deal with the legacies of the last 22 years of a culture of silence, of violent human rights repression, of a huge militarized state. So Gambia, you would come and visit, beautiful country to visit. I encourage everyone to go. But previously you would have seen military on the streets everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. If they weren't military, they were police. If they weren't police, there was some other security apparatus of the state, some man in uniform who was stopping you, asking you for ID, searching your car, you know, and people did not have they lived with fear of responding to that, because there were disappearances, there were killings, there were tortures. You could be arbitrarily arrested and detained for X amount of time without seeing legal counsel, without ever coming before a judge. So these were the types of things that ended up having a population very much living in terror under the apparatus of a state. So once he left, there was many calls. It was part of the political manifesto of the coalition that won, that they promised that there would be a truth recovery process. There would be a truth commission. So you got overwhelming popular support. You included this in your manifesto. So now you had to deliver. I was one of those people who was very worried that this was all being done too quickly, way too quickly. Now I'm like, well, it happened. The Truth Commission have just finished their hearings. They're now in the process of writing the report. And it's been very interesting to see a population pay attention to some very, very dark moments of our history, because there were many narratives. So you had someone say, oh, such and such was taken by the police in the middle of the night, but he was probably doing something. No, there were informants within the community who had said, oh, he's criticizing the president, or he's got a piece of land and, you know, he's taken it off X, Y, and Z. There were lots of really terrible ways in which disappearances and killings and sexual violence and the circumstances of all of that happened. It was a culture of silence, informants, and police and state repression. You don't undo those overnight. You could walk down the street today and still see the same guys in military uniform, in police uniform, who were there during the times of the human rights violation. The apparatus of the state remains intact, but everyone's waiting for the Truth Commission, right? So a lot of my field work went into military barracks, talked to police officers, talked to communities who had been victimized, talked to as many sides as possible as to why they would even participate in this process. And without a doubt, the most overwhelming response I got was that in order for us to move on as a society, we need to hear the truth. Truth is not a simple thing for a lot of people. You and I could watch the same event and have two very different perspectives.
Yeah.
So I think the moment of reckoning will come once the Truth Commission report is issued, because they're going to talk about who's getting prosecuted, who gets amnesties. They're going to write about what happened to your loved one, what happened to your disappeared. Not everybody's, because there's just too many, but it's a start. It's not and cannot be the finish. So when I look to Northern Ireland and see like, oh, you didn't have a Truth Commission here, but you had different ways and different inquiries and different modalities of trying to do fact finding and truth finding. And I thought, oh, what could Gambia learn from here? So yeah, I'm still in that process of thinking and percolating those ideas, because I think there's so much. I'd love to get a round table of like Northern Ireland and Gambia and just do this conversation about how we deal with the legacies of the past and what we can learn from each other. Because to me, the Truth Commission did not cover what has happened to the country, both just before independence and afterwards, because the way that the state was structured and the apparatus of the military and the police is all legacies of our colonial rule. I see those connections very clearly. The Truth Commission, because of the time frame, didn't look at that. So you're telling half the story there.
Yeah, you're wondering what Gambia can learn from Northern Ireland. I'm thinking here about what Northern Ireland can learn from Gambia, the Gambia, through you. I mean, you've spoken kind of quite, optimistically at points in this conversation. You've talked about, I mean, one of the things about you're optimistic about is young people in the Gambia. And
Yeah.
I look to, the role of young people in Northern Ireland, and that ship has sailed for me. I'm a different generation. I'm part of the problem, probably, But in terms of the issues that need to be addressed,
Yeah.
in the north here, would you be confident that our young people will have it within them to overcome, the obvious things that we see maybe, but some of the other things that aren't as obvious, gender inequality, you're talking about homophobia,
Yeah.
the other things that shouldn't be but are hidden, are below the surface, under the radar in Northern Ireland. Would you be optimistic that we, from what you've seen here, that we can get to a better future, one that in whatever guise all of us can feel part of, feel we belong in?
Oh, that's such a beautiful and big question. I am optimistic, and I think I have to be, because with an understand. So when I'm lucky enough to be able to, teach an array of young people here at Queens. But when I speak to young people here, what always just astounds me is the discussion around kind of civil liberties or conflict or equality as linked to the Troubles, as linked to the conflict, as linked to the history here, is then augmented with the reality of racism, sexism, patriarchy, homophobia. So they are that generation who are just at this really interesting intersection of the legacies of the past but also the realities of the present. And, you know, so many of my students will talk about being a feminist and growing up as a feminist, or there's one fantastic student I have who talks about it being a feminist as raised by her dad in West Belfast, in like Andystown. And she was like, I tell my dad he raised a feminist. He's like, no, I'm not a feminist, all that, that's you, you know, I'm also, and she's like, no, but you did, you get, and so they have this vocabulary, you know. And at the Black Lives Matter protest, the socially distanced one that they had at City Hall, I mean, I could have been brought to tears by the amount of young people I saw there. And I didn't know what to expect. But when I saw them, I was like, ah, yes, yes, because it's through them that they will have intergenerational conversations with their moms, with their dads, with their grandpas, with their grandmas, with their aunties and their uncles, because it has to be intergenerational. I don't believe we should just burden our young people with everything for the future. I think it has to be an intergenerational transformation. But I think what is so hopeful is that they've got a vocabulary, a tenacity, and an energy and creativity that I could never have imagined. Digital social media transforms so much of the way that we can do activism, you know, get the story out there, counter the narratives of the state. Whether it was, you know, the kind of, you know, you see it all the time with the Twitter hashtags, you know, and I think, so when a story comes out, people speak, young people speak, people across the board can talk. And I think that just gives me hope and energy. They've got a different vocabulary and tools and infrastructure to help mobilize and push for change. You know, so many of them who talk about like, well, I'm going to run for politics. They're not going to wait for politicians to do it. They're going to think about, you know, offices of power. And I think that is superb. But they've got the histories and they've got the understanding of so much that is relevant from the afterlives of partition, together with what is going on in contemporary. And also our young people in Northern Ireland are Black, are Chinese, are Asian, are mixed. So they are in a different space. They are in a different, the young people themselves are becoming more and more diverse. They're queer, they're trans, they're gay. And it's in that space that change is going to happen. I truly, truly believe that. But, you know, we need to keep listening to them, right? And we need to keep talking together. They got to listen to us. We got to listen to them. And so, yeah, but I definitely think it gives me so much hope.
Last question to you, and briefly, I mean, it's evident in our conversation, the affection which you have for the Gambia, first of all, and your enthusiasm and your, you know, your confidence in young people is almost contagious. You mentioned at one point a phrase, first female president of the Gambia. Does the role interest you? Because you know, I don't know if you've ever been asked that before, but just listening to you, you know.
Oh, gosh. You know, someone asked me this the other day, would I be interested in going into politics? And I said to them, no. I am a political, I love politics. I love reading about it. I love getting involved. And I said, no, because what I like to do is be like the advisor in the background. So you'll see like your president, and then there's this just person right here on the right-hand side, just there, just standing, just slightly ajar. That'll be me. That'll be me. That'll be me.
The queen maker rather than the queen then.
I was like, that role interests me, because yeah, but not the principal, not the person at the front. Oh no. Yeah. But
uneasy rest the head that wears the crown. Dr. Yassin Brunger, it's been a privilege and an education talking to you. So thanks very much indeed for joining us on this series and for putting your views to us on the line with your perspectives on partition. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much.